Folks, thank you so much for joining us tonight. A big thank you to Fox and to DreamWorks for letting us have this opening weekend. This is one of the motion pictures of the year, evidently. And just to have it here tonight, opening weekend, please, a round of applause for the We are really fortunate to have with us tonight one of the producers of Lincoln. Her very first produced by credit was a film that some of you may have seen called E.T., The Extraterrestrial. Not only her first produced by credit, but her first of, count them, 7 Best Picture Oscar nominations, which includes, others include The Color Purple, The Sixth Sense, Seabiscuit, Munich, Curious Case of Benjamin Button, and then just last year, War Horse. She's, of course, got a list of other credits a mile long. Movies like Alive, AI, Artificial Intelligence, Jurassic Park, Empire of the Sun, a personal favorite of mine, The Diving Bell and the Butterfly. The list simply goes on and on and on. Not only that, she and her husband, Frank Marshall, were honored several years ago by our guild with the highest honor that we give to motion picture producers, the David O. Selznick Achievement Award. And as if that wasn't enough, she is herself a former 2-term president of this guild. And when she first took office of the presidency, that is really what started us on the path that brought us really to this week when Studios Fox, which released this film, approved the producer's mark just this week, and it started with our guest tonight. So please, a warm welcome for Kathleen Kennedy. So thanks for joining us. I do want to start by saying that for all the historical verisimilitude of the film, I confess I was a little disappointed to see how it glossed over Lincoln's legacy as a vampire hunter. I saw that documentary they released earlier this year. I really didn't know half that stuff, I have to say. So when we've talked before about movies, one of the things that you said is the most fun and exciting is that you get to sort of become an expert on something you didn't become an expert on before. What was the fun part for you about, what did you get to dig into this? I mean, there's legislative process, and there's the Civil War, and there's, gender relations in the 19th century. Where do you walk into it?
It was interesting with this because, as I'm sure many of you know, there's so much that's been written about Lincoln, and when we had the idea of doing the movie, it coincided with a conversation that Stephen had with Doris Kearns Goodwin, who was about to begin her book called Team of Rivals. And so we were all working simultaneously. And today, Tony Kushner has a bookshelf of 350 books that he dipped into and read and looked at and talked about, and various versions of the script that were written by 2 other writers, and then eventually Tony. It took us over a decade before we finally arrived at a point of view of the story that we were going to tell. And I'm sure when you see this movie and you think, really, you read all that material and you decided to do the 13th Amendment? And I think that's what was kind of interesting about the process, is that as Tony was writing endless possibilities, Stephen recognized that there was something inside the passage of the 13th Amendment that identified a genre for him. It's interesting, I think every time I've been involved in a movie with Stephen, we usually always identify a genre, and for doing a story like this, where the drama is inside what is going on in Congress, it's not very obvious that a thriller might emerge from that. And I think that's what was so amazing in this process, is that Stephen recognized the tension and the storytelling possibilities that were inside such a dramatic event, and something that would have such an incredible impact on this country. So that, I guess, was the learning lesson. It was like, an amazing I suppose, master's class in Lincoln.
This may be really the most entertaining movie ever made about legislation. I mean, it really does. I mean, it's the cliche that it brings history alive, but it genuinely does to see these figures that we've heard about. How did you, in the early stages, once you found your way in, once you have your line into the story, where does the process begin for you in terms of starting to actually pull the whole thing together?
In a funny way, for me, I think it begins way early in the development process, because even though I'm not necessarily participating in writing the script, I'm thinking all the time and talking all the time, in this case with Stephen, about how we're going to approach the movie, what the attitude is about going into the movie. So it begins really early.
And so Daniel Day-Lewis, obviously at the center of this film, is, I can remember talking to Brian Grazer about one of the movies he made with Russell Crowe, and he said, well, without Russell Crowe there is no movie, that it just wouldn't have happened. Is that the same case? I mean, Daniel Day-Lewis is so indistinguishable from the part. If Daniel Day-Lewis doesn't want to do it, do you still have a movie? Is it we go to Adrian Brody and a lot of makeup? What's the decision process?
Yeah, I think we didn't have a movie without Daniel Day-Lewis. I think he was our first choice from the beginning, and I don't think that any of us could really see anybody else from the time we met him.
Did it take a lot of convincing? Obviously, he's a guy who does not take a lot of roles. I mean, he's very deliberate in his process, in all aspects of the process, not simply deciding what role to take, but actually embodying the role. How did you get him on board?
Yeah, he actually did turn us down in the early stages. And it was interesting because sometimes that's what you need to have happen in order to push yourself to the next step and get the script even better, and that's what we did. And then eventually he committed with Tony's script.
Now, he's an actor who's legendary for staying in character. Was he Lincoln the whole shoot through? Was he, at the craft services table? These donuts are a moral abomination. Was he Lincoln the whole time?
He was Lincoln the whole time. He was not complaining about the donuts,
So in terms of pulling the rest of the cast together around, obviously this is the central post that you're building the structure around, but bringing in Sally Field, for instance, as Mary, how did you? There are obviously so many talented actresses, who could fit that time. How do you narrow it down to Sally Field?
It was interesting because Stephen's known Sally for over 40 years, and when Sally heard that we were making Lincoln, she immediately called Stephen. And Stephen actually, to be perfectly honest, thought she might be too old. And Sally said, I'm not too old. I need to come in. I need to test. And she called and was very tenacious about it. And she came in, and Daniel came in with the test as well. And we did an audition. They said very little dialogue. They were absolutely brilliant together. And Stephen walked out of the audition and said, she's Mary, and Daniel said, she's Mary, and that was it. It was totally Sally that did that. She knew that she was Mary Lincoln.
And so this is a monumental cast, virtually it feels like every major actor working today seems to turn up in some, mutton chops somewhere. Who was it? Who surprised you to come in? There are obviously so many pieces of the puzzle. What were the surprises for you?
Oh, I think there were so many surprises. When we realized that we had 148 speaking parts, it literally took over a year to put this cast together. Massive auditions. The whole time we were doing War Horse, we were actually looking at auditions every single night. And we had this incredible opportunity to take some of the best actors working in this country. Interesting thing that Daniel Day-Lewis did, he insisted that every single person in the movie be an American. He did not want to hear an English accent. So it was an interesting challenge for all of us, because there would have been a tendency in a movie like this to maybe look across the ocean and look at the wonderful actors in England, and we couldn't do that. So it really forced us to turn over every rock to look at who was doing what in theater, television, movies, and we pulled together an amazing group of people. Every single person, I think you'll all agree, they're all wonderful. Even if they have one line, they're great.
So where did you guys settle on to shoot? Where did you find yourselves actually starting to roll film?
Well, we looked at a number of places, but we got very fortunate because in Virginia, in Richmond, Virginia, the buildings, some of the main buildings as you see in the movie, look very similar to the White House and the grounds of the White House. And we found out that they would be out of session for a series of months. And we talked, because it took so long to develop this movie, there was plenty of time to talk to the Film Commission and get an idea of how their schedule worked. And we arranged to go in and use all of the government buildings while they were out of session. And that's where we shot Congress and the exteriors, and so the whole movie we ended up shooting in Richmond.
Now, another one of the things that we've talked about, that you've stressed when we've talked before, is the importance of communication for producers in terms of keeping the lines of communication up with all your department heads. With a canvas like this, that seems like a monumental task. How did you organize your team such that you could know what was going on at all times and know who needs what wig where
Well, there's no question makeup and hair was a big department on this movie. But the other thing is, many of the people I'm fortunate enough to work with, I've made many, many movies with now. So Lois Burwell was our hair and makeup person, and I've done several movies with Lois. And she came in probably 8-9 years ago to do the first tests. So every time we would end a movie, and that's the beauty of working with people from movie to movie, is we would often carry over little tests and little ideas that we had, and we'd just shoot them while we were doing our other movies. So that ended up contributing, I think, to a real communication chain and a participation in the look of the movie very early on. Joanna Johnston did the beautiful job with the costumes. We were talking about how we were going to build the costumes the whole time we were making War Horse. And we found this group of people who had built all the uniforms in War Horse, and they did such a beautiful job that we had some of those people help us with the costuming in this as well.
So and this is two fairly expansive sort of early 20th century and 19th century period pieces in a row. Previously, most of your stuff had struck me as being more contemporary, looking back over your filmography, things like either that or future-oriented. What is it like for you to step back into the past to try and conjure up, what we normally think of as like these kind of sepia-toned images and actually make them like breathe and give them color and light?
Well, I think one of my favorite things in the end crawl of this movie, and I'm sure you noticed, were the number of people that helped us. And the ability to have access to the Library of Congress and all the people in the museums in and around Virginia and Washington, D.C., and the Lincoln Library. And we had a vast amount of material that people were making available to us. So it was incredible to step back because we had all these authentic documents that we could refer to. And I think that's what was extraordinary. I mean, people came out of the woodwork when they heard that we were doing Lincoln, and amazing amount of material that we were able to use for research, so really helpful.
Well, yeah, I have to imagine that people are still so passionate about him that I imagine this was a labor of love for literally thousands of people. Now, I'm sure we have some questions from you folks, and now I don't think we have any mics here, so you may just have to speak very loudly, especially if you're here in the front. I'm going to go, sir, in the third row. sorry, just a question in case the folks in the northwest corner didn't hear it, about your criteria for picking projects and what you look at when you're considering.
You know, it's funny because I look back over the number of projects I've worked on now over the years. I have such eclectic tastes that I hesitate to try to define exactly what I look for, but for me, I'm usually looking for something that has some kind of emotional resonance. Strong characters, and something that will move you.
Yes, a question. No, that was somebody just putting on their jacket. I'm sorry. Yes, so we can start.
With everyone being so willing to assist in this picture, obviously from the credits and involved in the case, with Lincoln being such an icon in American mythology, do you have any personal apprehensions about the subject and bringing this to life? I'm wondering what your personal responsibility would be by doing it.
Oh, it was huge. I think that has everything to do with why it took us so long. You know, Tony Kushner's first draft was over 500 pages long. I remember we were talking about this the other night, where we were just about this time of year, we'd gone to our family home on vacation up in the mountains, and I'd gotten word that finally Tony was going to deliver the script. And my husband's upstairs and he yells, "How long is this thing?" Because the printer is going, kicking out paper, and he goes, "We're out of paper, we're out of paper." So he literally got in the car and drove down the hill and had to buy a ream of paper to bring it back because the script was so long. And that began this process of realizing that he was dealing with the enormous responsibility of trying to take this vast amount of material and, frankly, nuances of various points of view on Lincoln and trying to distill it into the personality that you see on the screen. And I think that's where Doris Kearns Goodwin helped us enormously, because Doris did an amazing amount of research on her own, obviously, for Team of Rivals. And I think Tony would agree, and Stephen would agree, that the Lincoln that you see in this movie is the Lincoln that Doris found in her research.
Well, one of the things was Tony in front of the fireplace as you were beach 2 years ago discussing this film.
Really?
Yeah. It was during the writer's strike.
He wasn't writing, though, right?
No, he was he was on hiatus. And he was like, we were spent late hours over martinis and talking, and he was basically turning his hair out about stop it, you know.
Oh, yeah.
What the overwhelming thing was to stop. My question to you was, what were your feelings?
My feelings. Well, I think anytime you step into history, and certainly a character like Lincoln, you absolutely have a feeling of enormous responsibility to get it right. I mean, that's the thing, is unless you're going to immerse yourself like Tony did in reading 350 books, and I will confess I didn't do that, but I did read a lot, but I didn't read 350 books. But that's what happens when you get into doing anything with this kind of historical significance, is you do recognize the responsibility you have. At least to have a strong point of view. That's, I think, the important thing. You have to arrive at a position you're going to take on the story you're telling. And I think that's what this movie shows, is that the work that went into trying to find what the access point was to history in order to try to capture who the man was.
And I'm sure we all look forward to that original draft becoming an 11-hour theater piece from a cast of 5. You know. I want to get some questions from the back. Yes, in the way back, if we can get a question.
Yeah, with the political overtones of the movie, did you guys have a lot of discussion and debate about whether to release it before or doing what you did and releasing it after the election?
Yeah, we didn't have a lot. He's asking if we had any discussion about releasing the movie before or during the election, and we did talk about that. We talked about it right away. when we realized, I mean, obviously, here's the interesting thing. When we started developing this movie, we had no idea Obama would be our president. So that is rather extraordinary. I mean, it wasn't even in our sights. And that is quite amazing to be sitting here today, knowing what we know today. But once we realized that the progression of the movie was going to end up with the distribution being in the middle of an election, we felt very strongly that we did not want the movie to come out until after the election. We didn't want it to become political.
Because there's no chance of that happening now, surely. Yes, if we could get a question from up, yes, so, and if you could stand and give your question, that was a great innovation, sir, thank you. So if you could deliver your question, yes.
I was wondering if you could shed some light on the decision-making process to not show the assassination at the end. Was that something that was conceived in the early stages of development, or was that something that came about later on with different drafts of the script?
And that's quite a head fake there you do at the end of the...
That was always the way Tony structured the story. You know, it's interesting. I think what Tony realized and what we all talked about, there's many things that we all know, that we all, certainly as Americans, we learn, you know, from grammar school on. And I think that's something that Tony was acutely aware of when he was structuring the movie and trying to find ways in which he didn't necessarily go after the obvious structural beats.
We've talked a lot about Tony. I'm also curious about Stephen, who's obviously been a collaborator of yours for, you know, over 30 years now. What about his, you know, you two are, you know, obviously know each other very well, but what about his approach to this movie? Was there anything that seemed new to you? Was there any new move that he could take out that surprised you? That, oh, this is...
No, I think what was interesting is that Stephen recognized that this movie was so much about performance and language that he got out of the way. I think it's one of the more restrained movies he's ever done, because if you notice, I mean, one of the things I think anybody who knows Stephen's movies, you know he loves to move the camera, and he does it very well. And he doesn't really do that much in this movie. He really allows things to happen in the frame and to really allow the audience to move in and listen to what's being said rather than being aware of what the technique of the filmmaking is. And yet it's still cinematic, because in order to try to make this movie, this story, move in the sense of tension and suspense, he had to find a cinematic language. So I think his work is very subtle in this movie, far more subtle than anything I've ever done with him.
No, I'd agree. That you have so many interiors in this. I don't usually think of Stephen being an interior director, but so many sort of large and sort of detailed spaces in which you can have multiple people working within the frame and telling a story without having to pan across the landscape, you know, the way he would do.
Well, and I think it's extraordinary, too, watching him, because over the years, I've always said that I think Stephen stages scenes better than almost anybody. You always have a sense of geography, and in scenes that take place in Congress, it would be so easy to completely lose track of who's on what side, what's going on, and the fact that you never lose your way. You always know who's on what side, who's who. He's set everybody up. He's helped you recognize who's who. I just always find that amazing, how he manages to put that together, and I think that's really apparent in this movie.
We have time for a couple more questions, and we won't quite be able to get to everyone. We have a gentleman down here in the front.
Yeah, it was was a conscious thing. It was also interesting because we felt pretty insecure at the beginning of this movie. When we first looked at it, we thought, ooh, do people really get the context? This was the whole discussion of, should we put cards up? Should we let the audience know where they are? Should we let them know at what point in his term he is? Where are we in the war? All of these beats. It's interesting when you're trying to tell a story like this, especially when you're dropping in toward the end of Lincoln's life, trying to find ways to deal with that. But the pacing of it, we always knew was a thriller. I mean, it sounds funny to talk about this movie in that context, but that is the genre. And I do feel that every time I make a movie with Stephen, we do have that conversation. What is the genre? Because ultimately, it is a form of entertainment. We are telling a story, so identifying that is really important. And then that helps to determine pace.
Not to take all questions from the same area, but we have someone who's had her hand raised for a long time, and I want to give her a chance to ask a question.
Can you talk a little bit about the physicality of this production? Like, was there discussion between film versus digital? How long did you shoot? Stage versus locations? At the end of the location, just a little bit about shooting.
Well, first of all, Steven Spielberg is going to hold out longer than anyone else to have the conversation between film and digital. Getting him to shoot digitally, I think he is so in love with film. And as you can see the work with Janusz Kaminski, it's pretty tough to have him walk away from film. So that wasn't an issue. In terms of stage versus locations, once we knew that we could go into Richmond and use those existing locations and buildings, and also, quite frankly, we knew we didn't want to spend a huge amount of money on this movie. I mean, this is one where we knew it was risky. We knew finding an audience was going to be touchy. We had no idea the commercial potential of the movie. So, building sets, doing everything on stage. I would say that from the get-go, we were looking at going to locations and shooting practically. We shot for 62 days.
We had a few exclamations of, did not. I don't know. Folks in the back probably.
I always have to remind people, when I talk about Stephen's movies, hey, I haven't worked on a movie except 1941, which was the first movie I ever did with him, where he has shot more than 75 days. And that includes Raiders and Jurassic, and he is incredibly fast and very well prepared, which makes my job a lot easier.
Yes, another question from out there. I saw somebody had it says, wave your hand around. Okay, we'll just take the question. Guys in the back, you're losing your chance. The guys in the front, you're just lapping the field here. But go ahead.
Yes, I would say that that's very true. We had a lot of discussions well before shooting. Oh, let me repeat it. She was saying that Sally was on Leno and was talking about the process on the set, and that, you know, some of the ADs were dressed in period costumes. I don't want to take this so far as to think that they were wearing mutton chops and things like that. But I would say that everybody, and this was intentional, when we went into shooting this movie, we knew that this was a performance-driven environment. We knew that with all of these actors, including Daniel, who was going to, let me put it this way, he did 45 pages of dialogue in the first 2 weeks of shooting, okay? So to ask any actor to perform at that level, we knew, and he expected it, that it would be an incredibly professional and silent environment. So we had a lot of discussions with the crew ahead of time that the atmosphere on the set would be no walkie-talkies except on headsets, that people would not be in, you know, shorts and t-shirts and hanging out with coffee on the set and chatting and frankly doing the things we all do when we're hanging out on a set. None of that were we going to do on this movie. That it would just be a very, very different feeling. And I think that's what Sally's talking about. And I think it did impact the feeling on the set, and I think it absolutely created an environment where the actors knew that no one was as important as they were on the set.
Well, that emphasis clearly shows through in these performances that you've got, which are just across the board extraordinary, from the little kid on upward. And but now obviously the credits of this film were struck before the producer's mark was okayed. But I do have to say that it's a presidential movie. You were our president for 4 years. I was there for all of them, and really it's just been an incredible week for the Guild. It really did start with you and the markers that you laid down for the industry. And
Thank you, Chris. But I gotta say, there were a lot of people involved
Absolutely.
in the early days of that, so I want to acknowledge all of them too.
Yeah, that would take a Lincoln length.
Yeah.
But thank you, Kathy. Thank you so much for joining us.